put it at the centre of our economy, which is, before this, nature's just been pushed to the peripheries.
It happened quietly. No announcement, no ceremony, just a signature, and a queen who lost everything without being told. The signature that changed everything. The folder arrived before dawn, placed with deliberate care on the smaller desk that was never photographed and never discussed. This was not the desk of ceremony or tradition, but of endings. The lamp was already lit, casting a narrow circle of light over the leather surface, and the pen lay uncapped beside the papers as if the decision had already been made. Outside, the palace still slept, wrapped in winter silence, unaware that something irreversible was about to be set in motion. King Charles did not ask questions when the document was opened. By early December, questions had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The language of the order had been refined, narrowed, and rehearsed through weeks of legal review and private consultation. Every sentence carried intention. This was not an emotional act, nor a dramatic one. It was administrative, institutional, and devastating in its restraint. The order did not touch titles or marriages. It targeted something far more dangerous: authority. With a single signature, Queen Camilla's remaining ceremonial powers would be extinguished. Her influence over patronages, advisory roles, symbolic appearances, and internal visibility would be reassigned or quietly dissolved into the machinery of the crown. Nothing would be announced publicly. Nothing would be debated. The change would simply take effect, like a door locking without a sound. Once enacted, there would be no appeal and no reversal. Charles read the final paragraph slowly, not because it was unclear, but because it demanded endurance. His hand hovered above the page, the pen suspended in a moment that felt heavier than any coronation oath. Years of compromise, defense, and survival pressed into that pause. Then, with a controlled movement that betrayed nothing, he signed. The ink settled quickly, sealing a decision that had been forming long before the paper ever reached his desk. At that exact moment, Camilla was still asleep. 2 floors above, she lay unaware that the institution she had fought to enter had just finalized its retreat from her. No warning had been issued, no quiet conversation requested. The palace no longer handled endings with courtesy. By the time she would wake, the order would already be circulating through private channels, logged, duplicated, and secured with professional precision. As the morning advanced, calendars were rewritten and language softened. Staff spoke of realignment and long-term stability, careful never to say what was truly happening. No one used the word removal, but everyone understood the outcome. Camilla's authority was over, not as a wife, not as a presence, but as a force within the system. When she stepped into her sitting room later that morning, the shift was immediate. Staff avoided her eyes. Conversations stopped when she entered. Phones vibrated with messages she was not meant to see. Camilla had lived long enough inside the palace to recognize the signs. Something had happened without her, something decisive. And somewhere below her feet, locked away and already active, was the order that ended her royal power forever. The order no one could stop. The order that ended Camilla's power did not appear suddenly, nor was it born of a single moment of anger or betrayal. It was the result of a slow, suffocating accumulation of concern that had been building quietly for months, long before the pen ever touched the page. Inside the palace, there had been a growing consensus that something had gone wrong, not emotionally, but structurally. The balance between symbolism and influence had tilted too far, and the institution could feel it. It began, as these things often did, with whispers rather than warnings. Briefings that ran longer than scheduled, legal consultations that expanded beyond their original scope, advisors who began speaking less about public optics and more about long-term containment. Camilla's role had grown undefined, her reach expanding into areas that made senior courtiers uneasy. Not because she was reckless, but because she was present, too present, in spaces that were no longer meant to revolve around her. Princess Anne was among the first to articulate what others were only circling. In private meetings, she did not raise her voice or dramatize the issue. She spoke clinically, outlining overlaps, redundancies, and risks. Her concern was not personal. It was institutional. The monarchy, she argued, could not afford ambiguity at a time when clarity was its only defense. Power, once blurred, was almost impossible to reclaim without consequence. Prince William's involvement came later, but when it did, it carried weight. His focus was generational, shaped by the future rather than the past. He questioned optics, relevance, and public endurance. He asked whether the system could survive continued expansion of informal authority without accountability. He did not frame Camilla as a problem, but as a variable that no longer fit the model being quietly prepared for the next reign. Behind them, legal teams began their work, not to remove, but to redefine. Every clause was tested against precedent. Every ceremonial role was examined for necessity. The goal was not humiliation, but containment. What could be absorbed by the crown without disruption? What could be reassigned without notice? What could simply fade if left unsupported? The answers formed the spine of the order. Throughout this process, Camilla was notably absent, not by accident, but by design. Including her would have slowed the mechanism, introduced emotion, and risked resistance. The palace had learned that power, once alerted, rarely surrenders gracefully. Silence, in this case, was strategy. King Charles was briefed in stages, never overwhelmed, never rushed. Each update framed as a refinement rather than a loss. His health, his stamina, and his legacy were referenced gently but persistently. Stability became the refrain. Longevity is the justification. By the time the final draft reached him, the decision no longer felt like a choice. It felt like an inevitability he had been prepared to accept. What made the order unstoppable was not consensus alone, but timing. The monarchy was recalibrating, shedding excess weight, closing vulnerabilities before they could be exploited. In that environment, sentiment was a liability. The order moved forward not because everyone agreed emotionally, but because no one could argue structurally against it. And so, while Camilla continued her days believing herself secure, the palace finalized a future in which she would remain visible, but powerless. The order did not punish her. It simply made her irrelevant where it mattered most. Camilla's unraveling. Camilla did not learn the truth all at once. The palace never allowed revelations to arrive cleanly. Instead, it came in fragments, small denials dressed as scheduling conflicts, conversations that ended too quickly, and decisions already made by the time her opinion might have been requested. At first, she dismissed it as routine confusion, the kind that followed any seasonal adjustment. But the pattern refused to disappear, and patterns in the palace were never accidental. The first unmistakable blow came when a senior aide informed her that several long-standing patronage meetings had been postponed indefinitely. The phrasing was polite, almost apologetic, but there was something final beneath it. Camilla asked for clarification. The aide hesitated. That hesitation told her more than any explanation could. She had seen it before, on the faces of those who knew a decision had already been sealed somewhere above their pay grade. As the days passed, the omissions multiplied. Invitations stopped arriving. Briefings were shortened, then ceased altogether. Committees she once influenced no longer sought her input. Even the physical spaces shifted. Rooms she had freely entered now required advance notice. Corridors felt longer, quieter. The palace had not expelled her. It had hollowed her out from the inside. The realization hit her not with rage, but with vertigo. Power, she understood too late, was not something announced when it left. It simply stopped responding. And when she finally confronted a trusted courtier, the answer she received was devastating in its restraint. There had been a restructuring. It was approved. It was complete. And it was not open for discussion. Camilla retreated behind closed doors, where composure finally failed her. The collapse was not theatrical. There were no raised voices, no shattered objects. Instead, there was shaking, hands first, then breath. She sat alone, staring at a room filled with symbols that no longer obeyed her. For years, she had survived by adapting, enduring, and waiting. This time, waiting had worked against her. She attempted to assert herself quietly at first. A call returned, a message sent, a request framed as concern rather than demand. Each effort met a polite wall of procedural language. The institution answered her not with defiance, but with indifference. And indifference, she realized, was the most merciless form of rejection. What wounded her most was not the loss of authority, but the method. She had not been warned, not protected, not even granted the dignity of preparation. The palace had learned to remove influence without confrontation, and she had become its latest lesson. Somewhere beneath the shock, a darker understanding took hold. This was not about punishment, It was about containment. By the end of the week, Camilla's presence felt ceremonial even to herself. She moved through her days aware that she was being observed not as a participant, but as a symbol in decline. The crown she had fought so long to justify had not turned on her loudly. It had simply moved on. And in that quiet abandonment, Camilla understood the truth she had spent years avoiding. Power in the monarchy was never owned. It was borrowed, and her loan had just been called in. The palace turns cold. The palace did not announce Camilla's fall. It absorbed it. That was the most unsettling part. There was no rupture, no sudden vacuum, no visible struggle for control. Instead, the institution recalibrated with the quiet efficiency of something that had done this before. By the time Camilla fully understood what had been taken from her, the system had already adjusted to her absence as an authority. She was still present, still visible, still addressed with deference, but the gravity that once followed her had vanished. The first sign was ceremonial. Events she would once have anchored were reassigned without comment. Seating plans shifted subtly, placing her farther from the center, closer to the margins where symbolism outweighed influence. Programs were printed without her name in prominent positions. When questions arose, aides spoke of streamlining and focus, careful never to imply loss. But the message was unmistakable. She was no longer a decision-maker. She was an accessory. Behind the scenes, the change was sharper. Committees she had once guided were dissolved or quietly merged into other offices. Patronage oversight moved to desks that did not answer to her. Advisory channels closed, replaced by direct reporting lines that bypassed her entirely. Staff who once sought her approval now received instructions from elsewhere, not because they wished to abandon her, but because the structure no longer permitted her involvement. The palace was not being cruel, it was being precise. What made the coldness unbearable was its professionalism. No one challenged her openly. No one confronted her with justification. The monarchy had learned that confrontation created martyrs. Silence created erasure. Camilla remained physically present while being institutionally irrelevant, a condition more psychologically destabilizing than outright removal. Staff behavior changed in small, devastating ways. Conversations paused when she entered rooms, not abruptly, politely. Smiles remained, but they no longer lingered. Requests were met with apologies and deferrals. "I'll have to check. That's no longer under my remit. I'm not authorized." Each phrase chipped away at the illusion that she still mattered. The palace did not humiliate her. It simply stopped responding to her gravity. Even her schedule betrayed the truth. Days once packed with briefings and engagements grew strangely open. Gaps appeared where meetings should have been. Her calendar, once dense with relevance, now reflected ceremonial obligation rather than influence. She was invited to attend, not to shape, to observe, not to decide. The rhythm of power had moved elsewhere, leaving her stranded in a role that looked intact but functioned hollow. Publicly, nothing was said. The press noticed little at first. The monarchy had perfected the art of change without spectacle. There were no statements about her role, no headlines announcing her diminished authority. Instead, journalists began noticing what was missing: her absence from key moments, her silence on matters she once addressed, the lack of visible alignment between her presence and institutional direction. Speculation grew slowly, carefully. Inside the palace, the message was clear. This was not temporary. This was not a cooling-off period. This was structural. The monarchy was redefining itself around survival, longevity, and reduced vulnerability. Any figure whose influence blurred lines or complicated hierarchy was quietly neutralized. Camilla was not singled out. She was processed. What cut deepest was the loss of informal power. Formal authority could be reassigned. Titles could remain untouched. But the true currency of the palace had always been access. Who could speak freely, who could influence tone, who could redirect decisions before they hardened into policy. That access evaporated. Doors closed. Conversations moved to rooms she was not invited into. The court, once attuned to her presence, adjusted its instincts away from her. She felt it most during gatherings. At receptions and internal functions, Camilla noticed how bodies oriented themselves differently. Circles formed without her. Laughter drifted from clusters she was no longer part of. The palace had always been a living organism, sensitive to shifts in power, and it had already reclassified her, from participant to peripheral. There were moments when she attempted to reassert herself, a comment here, a suggestion there, nothing aggressive, nothing inappropriate. Each attempt landed softly and went nowhere. Responses were agreeable but non-committal. Decisions proceeded without her input. It became clear that her voice still existed, but it no longer carried consequence. The monarchy had not stripped her crown, it had stripped her relevance. What made the cold turn absolute was the absence of sympathy, not because the staff lacked feeling, but because empathy was dangerous. To comfort her would be to acknowledge loss. To acknowledge loss would be to question the decision. And the decision, by now, was settled beyond discussion. Even King Charles seemed unreachable in a new way. Their interactions continued, cordial and measured, but something essential had shifted. The institution now stood between them, not as mediator, but as barrier. Conversations remained surface level. Logistics replaced intimacy. Where once Camilla might have influenced tone or timing, she now received information after the fact. The palace had chosen order over partnership. As weeks passed, Camilla understood that waiting for restoration was futile. There would be no dramatic reversal, no apology, no acknowledgement. The monarchy did not regret decisions, it outlasted them. Those who adapted survived, those who resisted faded. She began to grasp the cruel elegance of what had been done. By leaving her title intact and her presence visible, the palace avoided scandal. By removing her authority quietly, it protected itself. By refusing confrontation, it denied her the opportunity to fight back. This was not exile, it was containment. The cold was not emotional, it was architectural. Every corridor, every schedule, every protocol now reinforced the same truth. Camilla remained within the palace, but no longer within its power. She was surrounded by symbols of status that no longer answered to her will, and in that meticulously managed stillness, the monarchy completed its work. It had not destroyed her, it had rendered her unnecessary. The marriage after power. When the palace stripped Camilla of her authority, it did not merely alter her position within the institution, it altered the balance inside her marriage. Power had always been the unspoken stabilizer between her and King Charles, the invisible architecture that allowed their partnership to function without constant negotiation. Once that power was gone, what remained was something far more fragile. Two people bound by history, loyalty, and endurance, but suddenly exposed to truths neither had wanted to confront. Their private conversations changed almost immediately. Where once there had been strategy, there was now avoidance. Where there had been coordination, there was now careful neutrality. Charles spoke in summaries rather than explanations, offering information after decisions were complete rather than during their formation. Camilla noticed the shift not because he became cold, but because he became procedural. He spoke to her the way the palace spoke to problems it had already solved. Illness hovered over everything. Charles's health, long managed quietly and with deliberate opacity, was now an ever-present justification. He was tired, he was conserving energy, he was delegating. Each explanation was reasonable on its own, but together they formed a wall Camilla could not penetrate. She understood, intellectually, that the crown demanded stability above all else. Emotionally, she could not escape the sense that she had been sacrificed to preserve it. What made the distance unbearable was that it was never acknowledged. There was no confrontation, no reckoning where pain could be named. The monarchy did not permit emotional clarity when it threatened cohesion. Charles did not tell her that her power was dangerous. He did not admit that he had chosen survival over partnership. Instead, he spoke of necessity, of timing, of forces larger than either of them. The language of inevitability replaced the language of responsibility. Camilla felt herself shrinking in conversations she once dominated. She had been his shield for decades, absorbing criticism, weathering hostility, defending legitimacy that was never freely granted. Now, legitimacy had been secured, and the shield was no longer required. The realization settled slowly but brutally. She had been essential to the journey, but optional at the destination. Their shared spaces grew quieter. Meals passed with polite conversation and careful restraint. Topics circled around logistics, schedules, and neutral observations. The intimacy that had once survived adversity now struggled to survive irrelevance. Camilla sensed that Charles was protecting himself, not from her, but from the consequences of acknowledging what he had done. To admit her loss, would be to admit his choice. Resentment crept in quietly. Not explosive, not dramatic, but corrosive. Camilla found herself replaying moments, decisions, promises made during years when loyalty was framed as mutual survival. She remembered the assurances that once they reached this position, the struggle would ease. Instead, power had tightened its grip, demanding a price she alone seemed to pay. Charles, for his part, appeared diminished in ways she had not anticipated. Without her influence smoothing tensions and managing internal frictions, the weight of leadership pressed more heavily on him. He was more isolated, more cautious. The very stability the palace sought came at the cost of warmth. Camilla observed this with a bitter clarity. The system had not only removed her power, it had narrowed his world. Yet he did not reverse course. The order remained in effect, the palace moved forward, and Charles, despite moments of visible strain, did not intervene. Camilla realized then that love within the monarchy was always conditional. It was permitted only so long as it did not complicate governance. When it did, it was quietly deprioritized. Their marriage entered a new phase, one defined by coexistence rather than collaboration. Camilla was still present, still acknowledged, still formally respected. But the partnership that once allowed her proximity to power no longer existed. She was no longer consulted as an equal, nor relied upon as a stabilizing force. She had become, in effect, a private companion in a public institution that no longer needed her. The silence between them became instructive. In that silence, Camilla understood that Charles had not acted out of cruelty or betrayal, but out of fear. Fear of instability. Fear of legacy collapse. Fear that the monarchy, already strained, could not survive another perceived overreach. He had chosen the institution because the institution had taught him that choice was always correct. That understanding did not soften the blow. If anything, it sharpened it, because it meant there would be no apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing. The monarchy did not apologize for self-preservation, and Charles, shaped by it since birth, could not step outside its logic without unraveling himself. Camilla faced a painful reckoning. She had believed that love, once secured, would protect her, that shared endurance would translate into shared authority. Instead, she learned that proximity to the crown was never ownership, it was permission, and permission could be withdrawn without explanation. The marriage survived, but it was altered beyond repair. Not broken, not dissolved, but redefined. Camilla remained by Charles's side, yet no longer within his strategic orbit. She was present for formality, absent from power. Their bond endured out of habit, history, and a mutual understanding that separation would serve no one. But intimacy, once fractured by institutional necessity, did not fully return. Camilla carried that knowledge quietly, absorbing it with the same discipline that had sustained her through decades of scrutiny. She did not confront Charles. She did not demand restoration. She understood now that the monarchy did not negotiate with grief, it outlasted it. And in the quiet aftermath of power, Camilla saw the truth with devastating clarity. She had not lost her position because she failed. She lost it because she was no longer required. A queen without a crown. The silence that followed Camilla's removal from power was not accidental. It was curated. In the weeks after the order took full effect, the palace entered a phase of controlled stillness, a period where nothing appeared to change and yet everything had already shifted. Camilla remained visible enough to avoid suspicion, present enough to satisfy protocol, but absent from every space where influence was forged. The monarchy had perfected this state, visibility without relevance, and now it became her permanent condition. Publicly, she was still addressed as queen. Privately, she was no longer consulted as one. Her appearances continued, carefully selected and increasingly symbolic. Safe engagements, non-controversial causes, moments designed to reassure continuity rather than project authority. Each appearance was stripped of strategic value, reduced to a reminder of what had once been necessary and was no longer so. She smiled, waved, fulfilled obligation, but felt herself drifting further from the center with every step. The press sensed something before it understood it. There were no dramatic headlines, no scandal to dissect, but there was an absence that could not be ignored. Analysts began noting patterns, her diminishing presence at critical moments, her lack of commentary on issues she once shaped quietly. The monarchy's tone had shifted, and she was no longer part of its voice. The story was not what had happened, it was what had stopped happening. Inside the palace, Camilla's name was invoked less frequently, not out of disrespect but because relevance no longer required it. Decisions moved faster without her input. The machinery of governance, once slowed by consultation and consensus, now operated with a narrower chain of command. Efficiency improved, tension reduced. The system had recalibrated exactly as intended. Camilla felt the consequences most sharply in solitude. There is a particular isolation that comes not from being excluded, but from being preserved without purpose. She was not cast out, she was not disgraced, she was simply no longer essential. The palace ensured her comfort, her dignity, her formal respect, but withdrew the one thing that had justified her presence at the highest level: influence. Time stretched differently now. Days lost their urgency. Engagements blurred together. The adrenaline of relevance faded, replaced by a quiet sameness that felt unfamiliar and deeply unsettling. For decades, Camilla had lived in reaction to criticism, to strategy, to survival. Now, there was nothing to react to. The absence of conflict revealed a void she had never prepared for. She began to understand the finality of what had been done. There would be no rehabilitation arc, no return to prominence. The monarchy did not circle back once it moved on. History would not record her fall dramatically. It would simply note her presence tapering into formality, her influence ending without spectacle. That was the institution's preference. Drama invited questions. Silence erased memory. Camilla's reflections turned inward. She revisited the long path that had brought her here. The years of endurance, the calculated patience, the public hostility survived through sheer persistence. She had believed that arrival would secure permanence, that legitimacy, once earned, would translate into authority. Instead, legitimacy had proven to be conditional, and authority always temporary. What unsettled her most was how smoothly the transition had occurred. There were no cracks in the facade, no institutional tremors. The monarchy did not wobble in her absence. It stabilized. That realization struck deeper than anger ever could. It suggested that her power, while real, had never been indispensable. The crown had endured before her. It would endure after her. Even her relationship with Charles settled into a quiet equilibrium. They moved together through public spaces, performed unity when required, shared private routines shaped more by habit than intimacy. There was affection, but it was muted by caution. Neither spoke openly of the decision that had changed everything. It existed between them like an unacknowledged truth, too heavy to confront and too permanent to undo. Charles, for all his restraint, carried his own burden. The crown sat heavier now, its demands unsoftened by partnership. He had chosen order over complexity, stability over shared authority. In doing so, he had narrowed his emotional world. Camilla observed this without satisfaction. The outcome had cost them both more than either had anticipated. Yet the monarchy considered the outcome a success. There were fewer internal conflicts, fewer blurred lines, a clearer hierarchy. The institution valued clarity above sentiment, and clarity had been achieved. Camilla's quiet removal became a model, a demonstration of how power could be withdrawn without fracture, without spectacle, without mercy. History would remember her cautiously, not as a usurper, not as a reformer, but as a figure who reached the summit and then receded, her influence ending not with scandal, but with administrative precision. The record would be sparse, the tone neutral, the omission deliberate. Camilla came to recognize that this, too, was a form of judgment, to be remembered vaguely, to have endured so much only to dissolve into footnotes. The monarchy did not punish her legacy, it minimized it. That was the final act of control. In moments of rare candor with herself, Camilla acknowledged a painful truth. She had believed proximity to power equaled protection, that once inside, she would be shielded by the same forces she had defended. Instead, she learned that the crown protected only itself. Individuals were tools, useful until they complicated the structure. The crown did not hate her, it outgrew her. As the months passed, Camilla adjusted outwardly. She learned to occupy her reduced role with discipline, to perform dignity without expectation. She cultivated routines detached from relevance. She learned how to exist within the palace without shaping it. This adaptation, born of necessity, became its own quiet form of survival, but something inside her never reconciled. There was no closure, no moment of acceptance that felt complete. The loss lingered, not as grief, but as a steady awareness of displacement. She had not been removed for wrongdoing. She had been removed because the monarchy no longer needed her strength. That knowledge was sharper than disgrace. In the end, Camilla remained what the palace required her to be: a queen in name, a companion in public, a symbol without command. The crown remained secure, the institution endured. And Camilla, once central to its survival, stood quietly at its edge, present, composed, and permanently powerless, a queen without a crown. Power in the monarchy rarely ends with noise. It ends with silence, paperwork, and closed doors that never reopen. Camilla's story is not one of exile or disgrace, but of quiet removal, proof that survival inside the crown is never permanent. Titles remain, smiles endure. But influence, once withdrawn, is never returned. In the end, the palace does not rage, explain, or apologize. It simply moves on, and those who once stood at its center are left to discover the cruelest truth of all. The crown never belongs to anyone. It only allows access, until it doesn't.